On a cold December night in 1982, deputies pushed open the doors of a crumbling brick castle hidden deep in the Georgia woods. Inside, they found two men murdered, their bodies surrounded by the eerie remnants of an isolated life, two slain mastiffs, occult artwork, and a towering stained-glass devil that seemed to glare down at the scene of bloodshed. To the outside world, this was no ordinary crime. It was a satanic killing, the work of darkness itself. But the truth of the Corpsewood Manor Murders was far more human and far more tragic. This is the story of Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom, two men who left behind society to build their own strange kingdom in the woods, only to be consumed by rumor, paranoia, and violence. It is a story where myth and fear collided with reality, leaving behind one of the most chilling and misunderstood crimes of the 1980s. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Macabre Record for more haunting tales from history's shadows. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? The night air in Chattooga County, Georgia, was biting cold when law enforcement arrived at Corpsewood Manor in December of 1982. Deputies had followed up on a tip that something terrible had happened at the strange brick home hidden in the forest. What they encountered when they stepped across the threshold would haunt them for years. The first sign was silence, unnatural, heavy silence in a house once filled with the sound of dogs and music. Then came the smell. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Blood. As their flashlights cut through the gloom, the beams revealed the lifeless form of Joseph Odom sprawled on the floor, his body riddled with shotgun wounds. Nearby, the hulking shapes of two English mastiffs, once protectors of the house, lay slaughtered. Each detail added to the growing sense that the men who lived here had not merely been killed, they had been executed. As the search continued, they found Charles Scudder, a former professor from Chicago, slumped in a chair, his head tilted unnaturally. 5 bullet wounds marked the end of his life, yet on his face was a frozen expression that some swore looked eerily like a smile. Behind him loomed the manor itself, half castle, half ruin, its walls decorated with paintings of demons, occult books stacked on shelves, and a massive stained-glass image of Satan staring down from above. For the deputies, it was a scene out of hell itself, and it didn't take long for word to spread. Reporters, neighbors, and even distant communities soon carried the story of the Devil's Castle in the Georgia woods, where rumors of ritual and blasphemy seemed to have finally erupted into violence. But the reality, as investigators pieced it together, was more complicated than the satanic headlines would suggest. The men who died here were not demons. They were human beings, eccentric, yes, and deliberately isolated from the world, but also intelligent, artistic, and perhaps tragically naive. Their deaths would become one of the most infamous cases of the 1980s, not because of what truly happened, but because of the myths people needed to believe. The murder of Scudder and Odom was brutal enough, but it was the mix of drugs, sexuality, and whispers of the occult that turned this crime into legend. Corpsewood Manor would soon stand not just as the scene of a killing, but as a symbol of fear, prejudice, and fascination with the forbidden. Corpsewood Manor was not easy to find, even in daylight. It stood miles from the nearest paved road, tucked away in the dense tangle of northwest Georgia forest. The men who built it seemed to want it that way. From the outside, the structure looked at once primitive and otherworldly, brick walls rising unevenly, gargoyles perched in corners, and arched windows that seemed to stare like hollow eyes. Inside, there was no electricity, no running water, and no modern conveniences. Candlelight cast strange shadows across the walls at night, making the house feel alive, almost breathing with its occupants. To some, it was a place of enchantment. To others, it was a fortress of evil. The locals whispered about it long before the murders. Children dared one another to wander close, though few ever did. Adults, less brave but more vocal, said the place was cursed. In the tight-knit communities of rural Georgia, outsiders were rarely trusted, and two eccentric men living in a self-made castle adorned with occult imagery only fed the rumors. When night fell and the woods pressed in on all sides, Corpsewood took on a presence of its own, ominous, foreboding, and strangely magnetic. Visitors who did make it inside described the experience as surreal. The air inside was thick with incense and smoke, the walls covered in Scudder's artwork, images of demons, fantastical beasts, and haunting faces. Books on alchemy, magic, and forbidden knowledge lined the shelves, and the ever-present gaze of the stained-glass devil seemed to watch every move. For those unfamiliar with art or philosophy, these symbols were frightening, confirmations of the stories they'd heard. To Scudder and Odom, however, it was simply their sanctuary, their retreat from a world they no longer wished to be part of. But in the south of the early 1980s, where church bells rang louder than reason, perception mattered more than truth. Corpsewood Manor was seen as unnatural, even dangerous. Its very existence challenged the way of life of those around it, a reminder that not everyone lived by the same rules or worshipped the same God. And so the house became more than a home. It became a stage upon which suspicion and superstition would play out, a silent witness to the growing storm of fear that was closing in. When the blood was finally spilled within its walls, it seemed to many like the fulfillment of a prophecy they had spoken into existence all along. The story of Corpsewood Manor cannot be told without understanding the time in which it unfolded. The early 1980s in America were marked by a shadow that stretched far beyond the forests of Georgia, a shadow cast by fear of the unknown. This was the age of the so-called Satanic Panic. Across the nation, headlines screamed of cults, ritual murders, and secret covens hiding in plain sight. Daytime talk shows warned parents that their children were at risk from music, books, and games that supposedly lured them into devil worship. Ministers thundered from pulpits that Satan was recruiting through rock albums and Ouija boards. The atmosphere was electric with paranoia, and every unexplained tragedy seemed to feed the hysteria. In small towns especially, suspicion of outsiders was nothing new, but now it had been given a new vocabulary. To be different was no longer just to be strange, it was to be dangerous. To reject traditional religion or to decorate one's home with occult symbols was enough to spark whispers of demonic allegiance. And Charles Scudder, a highly educated man who flaunted his rejection of convention, and Joseph Odom, his quiet but loyal partner, fit perfectly into the narrative of villains that the era demanded. They were gay, reclusive, and unashamedly unorthodox. In the 1980s rural Georgia, each of those qualities alone invited scrutiny. Combined, they made Corpsewood an irresistible target for gossip. The irony, of course, was that the Satanic Panic rarely uncovered actual cults or rituals. Most of its horrors were illusions, born of rumor and fear. But perception often holds more power than fact. And when two men built a castle in the woods adorned with demons and gargoyles, perception was enough to transform them into local legends. They became symbols, not people, living embodiments of everything the community feared about outsiders, the strange and the forbidden. By the time blood was spilled at Corpsewood, the stage had already been set. Reporters hungry for sensational headlines would not describe Scudder and Odom as victims of a brutal crime. They would describe them as Satanists, as corruptors, as men who courted evil until evil came calling. In truth, they were human beings trying to carve out a life apart from society. But in the climate of the 1980s, their humanity was lost to myth, and myth was far more profitable than reality. Long before the name Corpsewood Manor was whispered in fear, Charles Scudder was a respected man with a promising career and a life that seemed, on the surface, enviable. Born into privilege, he grew up in an affluent Chicago family, the kind that valued education, refinement, and appearances. By the time he reached adulthood, Scudder had fulfilled many of the expectations set before him. He earned advanced degrees in pharmacology, eventually securing a position as a professor at Loyola University. Colleagues saw him as brilliant, eccentric, and more than a little unconventional. Students remembered him for his sharp wit, his flamboyant sense of style, and his ability to make complex subjects sound like arcane secrets. But beneath the surface, Scudder carried a restless spirit. The trappings of wealth and academia did not satisfy him. He lived in a stately home in Chicago, filled with antiques and artwork. But even there he filled his life with the unusual. He kept pet monkeys, filled his rooms with oddities, and dabbled openly in occult symbolism, not because he worshipped demons, but because he found beauty and mystery in what others feared. To Scudder, the devil was not an object of worship, but a symbol of rebellion, of freedom from the suffocating norms of polite society. He was also a man who refused to hide his identity at a time when secrecy was often a matter of survival. Scudder was openly gay, unapologetically so, in an era when many still lived in the shadows. His relationships were no secret, and his flamboyance only magnified the sense among his peers that he was a man apart. He had carved out a comfortable niche for himself, yet the weight of expectations and the emptiness of routine gnawed at him. For all his success, Scudder grew tired of the city, of colleagues who whispered behind his back, of the endless grind of academic life. By the late 1970s, he was ready to walk away. In a decision that shocked those who knew him, Scudder resigned from his position at Loyola, sold his belongings, and began to dismantle the life he had built. He told friends he wanted freedom, real freedom, away from the constraints of money, status, and society. He wanted a place where he could live without judgment, surrounded only by what he loved: his art, his books, his partner, and his dogs. What he left behind was stability, respectability, and a life most would consider successful. What he walked toward was isolation, uncertainty, and ultimately tragedy. When Charles Scudder made the choice to leave Chicago, it was not a sudden impulse, but the culmination of years of disillusionment. The world he had built for himself was comfortable, yes, but it felt to him like a cage disguised as a palace. In his journals, he often reflected on the emptiness of chasing prestige, the boredom of repeating lectures to students who would forget his words, the shallow expectations of polite company. He began to see his wealth not as freedom, but as a chain. And so he decided to do something few men of his background ever dared. He would cut ties entirely. He sold nearly everything he owned, parting with antiques and valuables piece by piece until he had stripped his life down to its essentials. What remained he packed into a small collection of possessions: his cherished books, his paints and brushes, a handful of tools, and a supply of LSD that he admitted he valued for its ability to dissolve the walls of ordinary thought. He kept only 2 companions he could not bear to leave behind: his beloved English mastiffs, Beelzebub and Asenath, whose names reflected both his dark humor and his fascination with the occult. Scudder told his friends that he was seeking not just a new home, but a new way of life. He wanted to escape the constant eyes of neighbors, colleagues, and strangers who judged him for who he was and what he believed. In the South, where land was cheap and forests stretched endlessly, he could vanish into obscurity and live as he pleased. For him, this was liberation. For others, it was madness. And yet, in that madness, there was a clarity. Scudder believed he was stepping outside of society's cage, freeing himself to live authentically in a world he built with his own hands. When he left the city behind, he wasn't running from anything so much as running toward a dream, an experiment in self-sufficiency, in seclusion, and in the pursuit of a life untouched by the judgment of others. It was a romantic notion, one that appealed deeply to his sense of drama. But what Scudder could not foresee was that isolation does not erase the dangers of the world. Sometimes it invites them in. And in building his castle in the woods, he was laying the first stones of the tomb in which his story would end. If Charles Scudder was the architect of the dream, Joseph Odom was the companion who helped make it real. Odom's life had been marked less by privilege and more by hardship. Friends described him as quiet, even brooding, a man whose struggles with alcohol sometimes clouded his days. But what he lacked in refinement, he made up for in loyalty. To Scudder, Odom was more than a partner. He was an anchor, someone willing to leave behind his own world in exchange for a chance at freedom by Scudder's side. When Scudder first spoke of abandoning Chicago, of trading city streets and university halls for an isolated plot of land in the Georgia woods, Odom agreed without hesitation. He did not seek notoriety or recognition. What he sought was belonging, and he had found that in Scudder. For the two men, their relationship was unconventional for the time, not because of how they loved, but because of how openly they chose to live that love. In the late 1970s, most same-sex couples hid in secrecy. Scudder and Odom, however, made no such pretense. Their bond was visible, unapologetic, and woven into everything they built together. It was Odom's hands that helped carry bricks, stack walls, and clear the forest brush that would one day become Corpsewood Manor. It was his presence that filled the long nights with companionship, his laughter that eased the frustrations of living without modern comforts, and it was his endurance that carried them through the early years when the work was backbreaking and the progress slow. If Scudder was the visionary, Odom was the labourer, the partner who made vision tangible. Yet there was always a fragility to Odom. His drinking often became a way to dull the harshness of their chosen life, and in his weaker moments he leaned heavily on Scudder's strength. But the devotion was mutual. Scudder never spoke of Odom as a burden, only as a companion, inseparable from the life he wanted to create. Together they represented a union that defied both social norms and personal limitations. When they disappeared into the woods, they weren't just leaving behind the world, they were creating one of their own. Their love was written into the very walls of Corpsewood, brick by brick, a symbol of defiance against a society that had little room for men like them. In that solitude they found peace, but it would not last. What they had built together would soon be stained by the very hostility they had tried to escape. The dream of seclusion became real when Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom purchased a remote patch of land in the rugged hills of northwest Georgia. It was cheap, wild, and overgrown, a place where no one would bother them and few would even think to look. To most, it was inhospitable, a place better suited for hunting than living. But to Scudder and Odom, it was perfect. Here they would create something lasting, something that reflected their independence and their defiance. They began with nothing but tents and the most basic tools. Supplies were hauled in by hand, brick by brick, over rough ground that resisted every effort to tame it. The work was grueling, but for Scudder and Odom, it was also liberating. Each day of labour brought them closer to a life cut free from the burdens of the city. Slowly, their vision rose from the soil, a peculiar fortress of handmade bricks, its design less practical than symbolic. They called it Corpsewood Manor. The house was built in stages. 2 main stories, a tower-like structure, and thick brick walls that held the chill of the Georgia winters. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern luxuries. But there was beauty. Beauty carved into every detail Scudder added. He placed gargoyles on corners, painted dark and vivid murals inside, and above all installed a massive stained glass window depicting the face of Satan himself. To him, it was art, an expression of freedom. To outsiders, it was proof that the men in the woods were dabbling in darkness. But Scudder did not care what outsiders thought. He delighted in his eccentric creation, proudly welcoming the rare guests who made it to the manor and showing them the peculiar treasures he and Odom had collected. For him, Corpsewood was not simply a house. It was a philosophy made brick and mortar, a deliberate rejection of the world he had left behind. Odom, though less flamboyant, shared in this satisfaction. Their castle was crude, yes, but it was theirs. Every brick had passed through their hands, every corner shaped by their sweat. In time, the house took on a personality of its own, an eerie monument that seemed to brood in the forest. For Scudder and Odom, it was a sanctuary, a stage upon which they could live unjudged. For their neighbours, it was an enigma, half admired, half feared. No one could have known then that these walls, raised with such devotion, would one day become their prison and their grave. Beyond the castle itself, Scudder and Odom built a smaller outbuilding on the property. It was a place they called the Pink Room, and it would become the most infamous part of their lives at Corpsewood Manor. The Pink Room was a converted chicken coop, painted and furnished with mismatched mattresses, blankets, and shelves stacked with liquor. It was here that guests were invited to indulge in whatever pleasures were on hand. Scudder and Odom, though not wealthy by any means, always seemed to have bottles of homemade wine and enough intoxicants to keep visitors entertained. It was no secret that Scudder had brought a personal stock of LSD from Chicago, and though how much he shared is debated, the rumors quickly outpaced the reality. In the Pink Room, the usual rules of small-town propriety did not apply. Visitors, drifters, hitchhikers, acquaintances from nearby towns came to drink, smoke, and in some cases, sleep with whoever was willing. To outsiders, it was a den of sin, a place of indulgence that confirmed the worst fears about what the men in the castle were doing behind closed doors. To Scudder, however, it was a way of extending hospitality on his own terms. He was amused by the idea of creating a space where others could cast off their inhibitions, where judgment was suspended and pleasure was welcomed without guilt. But in rural Georgia, the existence of such a place could never remain a harmless curiosity. Stories began to spread, each one darker than the last. People spoke of orgies, of black masses, of rituals that blurred the line between sex and sorcery. Whether or not any of this truly occurred was almost beside the point. The image of the Pink Room was powerful enough to create its own legend, and legends in small communities often take on lives of their own. What Scudder saw as playful provocation became, in the mouths of others, evidence of depravity. The Pink Room solidified Corpsewood Manor's reputation as a house of vice, and it drew people who were curious, reckless, or dangerous. Among them were men who had little to lose, men who would come to see Scudder not as a generous host, but as someone who could be taken advantage of. What began as an eccentric experiment in freedom would, in time, become the bait that lured destruction to their door. In towns as small and close-knit as those around Chattooga County, people notice everything. They notice who attends church and who doesn't. They notice who works steady hours and who spends their days behind closed doors. And they noticed Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom. From the beginning, the two men stood apart. They were polite enough when spoken to, but they kept mostly to themselves, and their peculiar castle in the woods quickly became the subject of endless speculation. Children whispered about it on the school bus. Adults gossiped about it over coffee in diners. Everyone had an opinion, though few had actually been there. To the devout and conservative community, Scudder and Odom were not just outsiders. They were symbols of everything untrustworthy. They lived openly as a couple at a time when such a thing was rarely acknowledged. They decorated their home with gargoyles, occult books, and a massive stained-glass devil, which locals took as proof that they worshipped Satan. Their Pink Room gatherings, whispered about in half-truths, seemed to confirm it. It didn't matter that the two men rarely caused trouble, or that their eccentricities were mostly harmless. In the minds of their neighbors, they were dangerous simply by being different. The whispers grew darker as the years went on. Some claimed that Scudder used drugs to lure young people into his home. Others insisted that occult rituals were being held in the woods, that strange chanting could be heard if you stood near the property at night. There were even stories that sacrifices had been made, of animals or worse. None of these stories had evidence, but they didn't need evidence. Fear spreads more easily than truth. For Scudder, the suspicion was almost amusing. He once remarked that people believed what they wanted to believe, and he was happy to let them. His artwork, his devil imagery, his dramatic sense of style, all of it was designed to provoke. But for Odom, who cared little for performance, the hostility was harder to ignore. He bore the brunt of sideways looks in town, the muttered comments about the queers up on the hill. What to Scudder was a game of perception was to Odom a reminder that they were not safe. The gap between Scudder and Odom's world and the world of their neighbors grew wider with each passing year. The locals saw only the castle and its symbols, not the men who lived within it. And when fear replaces understanding, suspicion turns quickly to danger. That danger was already circling, long before the night when blood would spill inside the manor walls. Corpsewood Manor, for all its isolation, was rarely empty. Word travelled quickly through the rural backroads and among the restless youth that the men in the castle were generous hosts. Some came out of curiosity, hoping to glimpse the strange house with its gargoyles and devil's window. Others came seeking something more tangible, alcohol, drugs, or the promise of a night unbound by rules. Scudder, ever the showman, often welcomed them. He poured homemade wine, shared his eccentric art, and in the pink room offered an atmosphere where restraint was left at the door. For those who visited, it was unlike anything else in the county. For Scudder and Odom, it was entertainment in a life otherwise steeped in quiet isolation. But not every visitor was a friend. The openness that defined Corpsewood also made it vulnerable. Strangers of all sorts passed through the gates. Drifters, hitchhikers, young men looking for adventure, or those simply hoping to take advantage of what they could. Some left impressed by Scudder's charm and eccentricities, while others left resentful, believing there was more hidden inside the castle than they were allowed to see. The rumors of hidden treasures, stacks of cash, secret vaults, drug hoards, fed imaginations that were already inflamed by the manor's reputation. Scudder himself seemed unconcerned. He often said he had nothing of real value. The castle, though unusual, was built with his own hands from inexpensive materials. The liquor and wine were cheap, the books and art priceless only to him. Yet for those who looked at his life from the outside, the opposite seemed true. How could a man from Chicago, a former professor, a man with money enough to abandon it all, not be hiding some fortune in his eerie fortress? The question lingered, gnawed at visitors, and eventually gave dangerous men an excuse to act. Odom, more cautious by nature, sometimes bristled at the constant flow of outsiders. His drinking worsened under the strain, a way of numbing the anxiety he felt about the parade of unknown faces. The more people they let in, the more vulnerable they became. Yet Scudder's refusal to close the doors left them exposed. He treated life like a grand experiment, a theatre of the absurd where even danger was another act to be observed. That attitude charmed many, but it also blinded him to the fact that not everyone who came to Corpsewood was content to drink his wine and leave. Some wanted more, and soon they would return to take it by force. Among the many who wandered through Corpsewood's gates was a young man named Kenneth Avery Brock. To the locals, Brock was already a troubled figure, restless, unreliable, a drifter even in his own hometown. Born into poverty and raised in instability, he grew up with little direction and fewer opportunities. School never held his attention, and work was inconsistent at best. Those who knew him described a young man prone to resentment, someone who often felt overlooked, cheated, or dismissed. By the time he was in his 20s, Brock was searching for belonging, but mostly finding trouble. When he encountered Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom, the encounter was unlike anything in his life before. Here was a man, Scudder, educated, flamboyant, confident, living in a castle he had built with his own hands. The eccentric professor treated Brock with a kind of casual acceptance that he rarely experienced elsewhere. At Corpsewood, there were no expectations, no lectures about responsibility, no judgment about his failures. There was wine, there was laughter, and in the pink room, there was freedom. Brock became a frequent visitor, drinking and indulging in the intoxicating atmosphere that Scudder curated. But beneath his fascination lay a simmering bitterness. Brock was impressed by Scudder's independence, yet also envious of it. He lived in a trailer, broke and drifting, while Scudder seemed to live in abundance, even if much of it was illusion. The rumors of hidden wealth, of secret stashes of drugs or cash, began to lodge themselves in his mind. And with each return to Corpsewood, the gap between what he had and what he believed Scudder possessed grew wider, sharper, harder to ignore. Brock was not inherently violent, but he was impressionable, and his anger made him vulnerable to influence. He began to share his stories about Corpsewood with others, framing Scudder as a man who had riches hidden away, a man who could be taken advantage of. Whether he believed this fully, or whether it was the wine and frustration speaking, hardly mattered. The seed was planted, and soon someone far more dangerous than Brock himself would take hold of it, twist it, and push him down a path from which there would be no return. If Kenneth Avery Brock was the restless, misguided youth, Tony West was the force that gave Brock's resentment its deadly shape. West was older, harder, and far more dangerous. Unlike Brock, who drifted through life with a sense of aimlessness, West carried himself with purpose, though that purpose was often violent and self-serving. His past was riddled with crime, from petty theft to violent outbursts, and he had already spent time behind bars. To those who knew him, West was a man who thrived on control. He was domineering, quick to anger, and unflinching in his willingness to use intimidation to get what he wanted. When Brock confided in West about his visits to Corpsewood, it was like pouring gasoline onto a fire. Brock spoke of the strange castle in the woods, of the wine and drugs, of the man who had abandoned a life of wealth and supposedly filled his home with treasures. In Brock's telling, Corpsewood became less of an eccentric retreat and more of a hidden vault, guarded only by two men who seemed oblivious to the dangers around them. West listened, and in his mind, opportunity took root. West was the kind of man who believed the world owed him more than it gave, and he saw in Corpsewood a chance to take what he thought he deserved. He latched onto Brock's stories, encouraging the idea that Scudder and Odom were hiding valuables. He painted a picture of easy riches waiting just beyond the tree line, wealth that could be theirs if they had the nerve to seize it. Brock, eager for approval and already convinced that Scudder had more than he admitted, fell easily under West's influence. But West's motivations went deeper than greed. The tales of devil imagery, of occult books and stained-glass demons stirred something darker in him. He despised Scudder, not personally, but symbolically. To West, Scudder represented arrogance, flamboyance, and a lifestyle that defied the values West claimed to hold. In truth, his disdain may have been nothing more than envy cloaked in moral outrage. Still, he convinced himself, and perhaps Brock as well, that what they planned to do was not just robbery, but retribution. Together, the impressionable young man and the hardened manipulator formed a dangerous pair. With Brock providing the access and West providing the will, their twisted partnership set the stage for violence. The dream that Scudder and Odom had built brick by brick was about to collide with the rage and greed of men who saw it not as a sanctuary, but as a target. At first, Kenneth Brock's presence at Corpsewood Manor seemed harmless enough. Scudder welcomed him as he did so many others, offering wine, laughter, and a seat in the strange little kingdom he had created. Brock returned often, sometimes bringing along friends, sometimes arriving alone, always accepted without suspicion. To Scudder, he was just another drifter drawn to the novelty of the castle. To Odom, he was a reminder of the steady stream of strangers who never seemed to stop appearing. For Brock, though, each visit deepened his fascination with what he believed lay hidden within the manor walls. It wasn't only the wine and hospitality that kept him coming back. Brock admired Scudder in ways he may not have admitted. The professor's eccentricity, his command of attention, even his refusal to care what others thought, all of it was so different from Brock's own life of frustration and limitation. Yet admiration, when twisted by resentment, can curdle into something darker. Every time Brock left Corpsewood, he returned to the bleak reality of poverty, a trailer with little food, and the knowledge that he owned almost nothing. Scudder, in Brock's mind, had chosen to abandon wealth, yet still seemed surrounded by abundance. It didn't add up, and Brock convinced himself there had to be more. Enter Tony West. With West's ear bent toward him, Brock's stories became less about harmless eccentricities and more about hidden riches. He spoke of trunks filled with cash, of drugs worth small fortunes, of gold and silver ornaments stashed away in the castle's corners. Whether Brock believed these tales or was inflating them to impress West is unclear, but once the words were spoken, they could not be taken back. West latched onto them, pressing Brock to reveal more, feeding his doubts and shaping them into conviction. The two began to plan. At first, it was talk, idle speculation fueled by drink and frustration. But the talk hardened. West assured Brock that men like Scudder were weak, that no one would ever miss them, that their castle was nothing more than a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Brock, torn between his uneasy affection for the professor and his own bitterness, was pushed toward a decision he might never have made on his own. In time, their friendship with Scudder and Odom became a mask, a way to move freely in and out of the manor while quietly plotting against its owners. The hospitality that Scudder so freely offered would be repaid not with gratitude, but with betrayal. And as the winter of 1982 drew near, that betrayal was about to take its bloody form. The evening of December 12, 1982 began like so many others at Corpsewood Manor, with laughter, smoke curling into the air, and the easy hum of conversation echoing through the pink room. Kenneth Brock arrived at the castle with Tony West in tow, along with two other acquaintances. To Scudder and Odom, it must have seemed like nothing unusual. Visitors came and went so often that a night of company was hardly a surprise. The guests were greeted with wine, as always, homemade and heady, poured into mismatched glasses in the glow of candlelight. The atmosphere was familiar, indulgent, relaxed, and soaked in the strangeness that made Corpsewood a magnet for the curious. The dogs roamed lazily at first, then curled near Odom, who tended to them with a quiet affection. Scudder, dressed in his characteristic eccentric garb, entertained the group with stories, a host in his element. The pink room, with its mattresses and the haze of smoke, seemed to invite abandon. Whatever differences or suspicions might have lingered outside, inside the little outbuilding the evening unfolded like so many before it, carefree and unguarded. Brock played his part well, blending in with the revelry, drinking, laughing, and masking the turmoil underneath. West, meanwhile, observed closely, biding his time. The plan that had grown in their minds was not yet in motion, but the stage was set. Every sip of wine, every careless laugh, every moment of trust brought the night closer to its breaking point. For Scudder, there was no reason to suspect treachery. He had always believed in opening his door, in welcoming even the roughest of visitors without judgment. Perhaps, in his academic way, he saw these encounters as experiments, each guest another subject in his ongoing study of human behavior. He had faced hostility before, endured gossip and suspicion, but here, within the walls he had built, he seemed untouchable, safe. But beneath the warmth of the fire and the haze of wine, danger was coiled tight, waiting. Brock and West had not come only to drink. They had come armed, and as the night stretched on, the mask of camaraderie would begin to slip. What began as a gathering of odd companions would soon descend into violence, shattering the illusion of safety that Scudder and Odom had built in their remote sanctuary. The blood that would stain Corpsewood's bricks was already written into the evening. It was only a matter of time before the first shot rang out. The shift from laughter to terror was almost imperceptible at first. One moment, the pink room echoed with the easy rhythm of drinking and chatter. The next, tension gripped the air like a storm rolling in. Tony West, who had been quiet and watchful, finally revealed his purpose. With cold deliberation, he pulled a rifle from his side, the gleam of steel catching the candlelight. The sound of cocking the weapon cut through the haze of wine and smoke like a blade. The room fell silent. At his signal, Kenneth Brock followed, fumbling but resolute, raising his own gun. Whatever uncertainty Brock had harbored evaporated in that instant. Fear and adrenaline took control, pushing him further down the path West had set before him. Scudder, seated comfortably only moments earlier, froze at the sudden betrayal. Odom, startled and already unsteady from drink, could only watch as the nightmare unfolded. The mastiffs, once guardians of the manor, reacted first. With protective ferocity, they lunged toward the intruders, their growls reverberating off the walls, but the rifles spoke louder. Shots cracked through the night, echoing in the surrounding forest. The dogs fell, their bodies silenced by violence as brutal as it was swift. Their deaths, in many ways, marked the first true shattering of Corpsewood's sanctuary. For Scudder and Odom, it was the moment safety was stripped away entirely. West's voice filled the room, sharp and commanding, ordering Scudder to reveal where he had hidden his money. The professor, ever composed even in crisis, responded with a strange mixture of calm and defiance. He insisted there was nothing to find. His wealth had been left behind in Chicago. Here in the woods, he owned little of real value. But to West, this only sounded like mockery. The more Scudder refused, the more convinced his attackers became that treasure was concealed somewhere within the bricks. Odom tried to intervene, his movements clumsy, his words slurred with drink, but West was merciless. The rifle turned toward him, and in an instant the shots rang out again. Odom collapsed, his life ending on the floor of the pink room where he had shared so many nights of escape. The betrayal was complete, the trust shattered. The laughter of the evening was gone, replaced by the ringing of gunfire and the choking smell of blood and smoke. Scudder remained alive, but bound in fear and disbelief. He had welcomed these men as guests. Now, in the ruin of his pink room, he understood. They had not come to share in his freedom. They had come to destroy it. After Odom's body fell to the floor and the mastiffs lay silent, Charles Scudder stood alone against the storm. His eccentric fortress, his philosophy of freedom, his hospitality, all of it had collapsed in the span of minutes. Now he was face to face with the betrayal he had never believed possible. Bound and held at gunpoint, he was forced to walk through the manor that had been his sanctuary. West and Brock demanded to know where he had hidden his supposed fortune. Every room became an interrogation chamber, every corner of his carefully crafted life a stage for cruelty. But Scudder did not yield. Whether it was arrogance, courage, or simply resignation, he insisted again and again that there was nothing to give. His wealth had been stripped away long ago, left behind in Chicago. All he had were his books, his art, and his crumbling castle. The demands grew louder, the threats sharper, but Scudder answered with a calmness that seemed almost to taunt his attackers. Some later claimed that he even laughed, a mocking chuckle that infuriated West, convincing him that the professor was still hiding something. West's temper snapped. He leveled the rifle at Scudder and, without hesitation, pulled the trigger. The first shot struck, but it did not kill him. The professor staggered, wounded but still upright, his eyes fixed on the men who had invaded his home. Another shot followed, and another. The bullets tore into him, 5 in total, until finally he slumped into a chair, his body broken. Witnesses later said that even in death, Scudder's face bore an eerie expression. Some described it as a smirk, as if he had carried his defiance into his final breath. Others believed it was nothing more than the frozen contortion of a man caught by sudden violence. Yet the image lingered, feeding the legend. The eccentric professor who had mocked his killers, smiling even as they tried to strip him of everything. For West and Brock, the act was meant to end the night, but instead it marked the beginning of their downfall. They had expected riches, a stash of wealth hidden behind occult symbols. What they found was only blood and silence. The castle that had seemed so full of mystery yielded no treasure, no fortune, only the corpses of the men who had built it with their own hands. The dream of freedom that Scudder and Odom had fought for was extinguished in gunfire. Corpsewood Manor, once their sanctuary, was now a tomb. When the gunfire ceased, a heavy silence fell over Corpsewood Manor. The air, once thick with incense and laughter, now reeked of gunpowder and blood. The bodies of Joseph Odom and Charles Scudder lay lifeless, the mastiffs sprawled nearby, guardians struck down in vain. Yet for Tony West and Kenneth Brock, there was little time to dwell on the carnage. Their minds turned quickly to the purpose that had brought them here, the search for riches they believed must be hidden within the strange castle. They moved from room to room, prying open chests, pulling books from shelves, tearing apart drawers. But the treasures they imagined were nowhere to be found. There was no trunk of gold, no stacks of cash waiting to be taken. What they found instead were relics of a life devoted to eccentricity and intellect, shelves crammed with philosophy texts, volumes on alchemy and the occult, jars of homemade wine, paintbrushes stiff with use. These were the possessions of men who had chosen to live differently, not secretly wealthy men concealing their fortune. West grew increasingly frustrated, his anger boiling over as he overturned furniture and smashed fragile objects in his path. Brock, though shaken, followed his lead, desperate to believe that something valuable was hidden somewhere within these brick walls. But Corpsewood gave up nothing of worth. The killers were left with only the disappointment of realizing they had been chasing a mirage. Still, they gathered what they could. A few minor items were stuffed into bags, personal keepsakes, food, even clothing. In their desperation, they seemed almost aimless, stealing not for wealth but for the hollow need to justify the blood they had spilled. Every object they touched was stained, not in value, but in the memory of violence. As they finally stepped back into the cold night, the stillness of the forest seemed to mock them. They had destroyed 2 lives, silenced the laughter of Corpsewood, and yet gained almost nothing. The castle remained, looming behind them in eerie quiet, its windows reflecting candlelight onto the corpses within. Whatever darkness the locals had whispered about had not brought the men's deaths. It was greed, anger, and fear that had stained those bricks red. The dream of treasure was gone, but the weight of murder now clung to them. And as they fled into the night, carrying scraps from a shattered home, the wider world would soon come to know the names of Corpsewood Manor and the blood that had been spilled within its walls. The night air outside Corpsewood was sharp and biting, but for Brock and West it carried no relief. Their rifles still warm, their nerves rattled, they stumbled from the castle with bags of meagre spoils and the weight of 2 murders pressing down upon them. The eerie silence of the forest seemed to follow them as they retreated down the rough dirt road, headlights cutting through the trees as they sped away from the fortress they had turned into a tomb. Yet escape was not freedom. Their flight only deepened the chaos they had unleashed. At first, there was no clear plan. They had expected riches, something worth the bloodshed. Instead, they carried little more than food, clothes, and trinkets. The disappointment hardened into rage, and rage into recklessness. In their attempt to cover their tracks and secure an escape, they spiraled further into violence. They traveled south, still armed, still intoxicated with the power and fear of what they had done. But murder, once committed, rarely stays contained. The hunger to justify the crime seemed to gnaw at them, and soon it demanded more blood. On their journey, they crossed paths with a young naval officer and his wife. The couple had stopped to offer help, unsuspecting of the danger that stood before them. In a chilling echo of what had happened at Corpsewood, West and Brock turned their weapons on them. The encounter ended in blood, the couple murdered without mercy, their lives taken in what seemed like a continuation of the madness that had begun in the Pink Room. It was no longer just a robbery gone wrong, it was a killing spree. By now their faces were known. News of the Corpsewood murders spread quickly through local channels, and law enforcement began piecing together the identities of the fugitives. The story of the castle, the devil's stained glass, the eccentric professor and his slain companion, it was sensational fuel for reporters. And as Brock and West drove across state lines, their images burned into the evening broadcasts, their trail grew ever more desperate. Every mile put more distance between them and the Georgia woods, but also drew them closer to capture. Their erratic path left behind a chain of violence and panic. For them, there was no going back, no undoing what had begun in the shadows of Corpsewood. Their spree was not only a flight from justice, it was the unraveling of 2 men who, in their greed and fury, had destroyed far more than they ever gained. As dawn broke over Chattooga County, news of the killings spread like wildfire. Sheriff's deputies who had entered Corpsewood Manor the night before emerged shaken, their reports grim and filled with details that seemed almost too bizarre to believe. Within hours, word reached the small towns nearby, then the state, and soon the nation. Headlines screamed of devil-worship murders in Georgia, complete with lurid accounts of stained-glass demons and occult texts. What had begun as a local tragedy was transformed into national spectacle, and with it came pressure to find the killers before they struck again. Law enforcement mobilized quickly. The names Kenneth Avery Brock and Tony West surfaced early in the investigation, supplied by those who had known them in the area and recognized their ties to Scudder and Odom. Arrest warrants were issued, descriptions circulated, and manhunts launched across state lines. The brutality of the crime, combined with the occult imagery of Corpsewood, painted the fugitives not just as criminals, but as predators steeped in evil. Citizens were warned to be cautious, to lock their doors, to report any sightings. In communities already primed by years of satanic panic rhetoric, the fear was immediate and overwhelming. The manhunt stretched across the southeast. Brock and West, armed and unstable, were sighted in different towns, their movements erratic as they sought shelter, food, and escape routes. Each report sent waves of panic, though often the fugitives slipped away before officers could close in. The murders of the naval officer and his wife only added urgency, proving that the men were willing to kill again without hesitation. Newspapers and television reports fed on every detail, embellishing where fact was thin, weaving tales of satanic rituals and sinister cult activity. For many Americans, the murders at Corpsewood became the ultimate proof that evil lurked in unexpected places, that the paranoia preached from pulpits and printed in tabloids was justified. The killers themselves, however, were not occult masterminds. They were two desperate men, driven by greed and rage, stumbling deeper into their own undoing. The dragnet grew tighter with each passing day. Law enforcement agencies coordinated, tips poured in, and the fugitives' circle of movement shrank. They had tried to outrun the law, but the trail of violence they left behind made them too visible, too infamous to hide. It was only a matter of time before the walls closed in and the manhunt that had gripped the nation reached its inevitable conclusion. The chaos of the manhunt could not last forever. For all their bravado and recklessness, Kenneth Avery Brock and Tony West were hardly skilled fugitives. Their movements were sloppy, their decisions fueled more by panic than strategy. With their faces plastered across newspapers and television screens, every gas station stop, every roadside encounter carried the risk of recognition. The net was tightening. It was Brock who broke first. The young man who had once laughed and drank in the pink room now found himself overwhelmed by guilt and fear. He had never been hardened like West. The weight of Odom's death, of the professor's execution, pressed against him relentlessly. After days on the run, exhausted and unable to bear the pressure, Brock surrendered to authorities. His confession came quickly, spilling out details of the night's events with the frantic urgency of a man desperate to unburden himself. He named Tony West as the mastermind, describing how the older man had planned the robbery, fueled the violence, and pulled the trigger with cold certainty. With Brock in custody, the hunt for West narrowed. Law enforcement traced his path, following the trail of stolen cars and scattered sightings. Eventually, he too was cornered and captured. Unlike Brock, West showed no sign of remorse. He maintained a hardened defiance, insisting he had been justified, that Scudder and Odom were degenerates who deserved their fate. It was a defense rooted in the prejudice and paranoia of the time, one that he clung to even as the evidence mounted against him. The arrests brought a measure of relief to the terrified communities of northwest Georgia. The killers of Corpsewood were no longer roaming free, and the sense of dread that had hung over the county began to ease. Yet the story was far from over. With the killers in custody, the courtroom would soon become the next stage for the drama. Reporters descended in greater numbers, eager to chronicle every detail of the trials that promised both sensational headlines and a public reckoning with the myths that had surrounded the castle in the woods. For Scudder and Odom, there would be no justice that could restore what was lost. But for the nation transfixed by the tale of Corpsewood Manor, the capture of Brock and West was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where truth and myth would clash beneath the harsh lights of the courtroom. The capture of Kenneth Brock and Tony West might have closed one chapter of the Corpsewood saga, but for the media it was only the beginning. Reporters swarmed the quiet towns of northwest Georgia, notebooks in hand, cameras flashing, eager to turn tragedy into spectacle. They were not content to tell the story of two drifters who killed out of greed. That story, though grim, was too ordinary. What they found instead, inside Corpsewood Manor, the stained glass devil, the occult paintings, the shelves lined with books on magic and alchemy, was irresistible. It gave them a narrative perfectly suited to the times, a satanic killing. The early 1980s were already soaked in fear of hidden cults and demonic conspiracies. Talk shows warned parents about heavy metal music, dungeons and dragons, and Ouija boards. Evangelists thundered from pulpits about the devil's hand in American life. Against that backdrop, Corpsewood Manor became the perfect symbol. Headlines blared phrases like devil worship murders and occult castle killings. Scudder was painted not as a victim, but as a Satanist whose bizarre lifestyle had invited doom. His art was evidence, his eccentricity was motive, his sexuality was twisted into accusation. Odom, quiet and loyal in life, was reduced to little more than a side character in the legend. Television crews filmed the manor's ruins, their lenses lingering on gargoyles and broken wine bottles, while narrators spoke gravely of orgies and rituals. Few stopped to ask whether any of it was true. To the public, truth mattered less than myth, and myth was far more entertaining. In the hysteria of the Satanic Panic, every strange symbol became proof, every eccentric habit became a sin. The frenzy not only shaped public perception, but also influenced how the killers framed their own defense. West, especially, leaned into the narrative, claiming he had rid the world of degenerates steeped in evil. He positioned himself not as a murderer, but as a man acting against wickedness. That such a claim found even the faintest echo of sympathy in some corners of society spoke volumes about the prejudice of the time. In truth, there had been no cult, no sacrifice, no treasure trove of dark magic. There had only been two men who sought peace in isolation, and two others who destroyed them out of greed and envy. But the power of myth ensured that Corpsewood Manor would never be remembered simply as a crime scene. It would live on as a legend of Satan, sex, and blood in the woods. The courtroom was crowded when the cases of Kenneth Brock and Tony West were finally brought to trial. Spectators packed the benches, journalists filled the aisles, and television cameras hovered outside, all eager to capture the next chapter in the Corpsewood saga. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was theatre, with the strange castle in the woods and its eccentric occupants serving as the backdrop for a drama that blended fact, rumour, and fear. Brock's trial came first. By the time he faced the jury, his role in the murders was well known, but so too was his confession. Tearful, visibly shaken, he told the court how the events had spiraled out of control, casting himself as a follower swept up in the violence of Tony West. His defense portrayed him as naive and easily manipulated, a man who had been led astray rather than a cold-blooded killer. The jury, hearing of his youth, his remorse, and his willingness to testify, spared him the death penalty. Instead, Brock was sentenced to life in prison, where he would have decades to reflect on the night he traded curiosity and envy for murder. Tony West's trial carried a different tone entirely. Defiant and unrepentant, West never wavered in his claim that the killings had been justified. He framed Scudder and Odom as perverse, corrupt men who lured the innocent with drugs and debauchery. In West's telling, the murders were not born of greed but of righteous disgust. The prosecution, however, dismantled his story piece by piece, presenting evidence of premeditation, of weapons brought with intent, of violence carried out with merciless precision. Witnesses described West's influence over Brock, his control, his cold demeanour. The jury took little pity on him. Like Brock, he was spared the electric chair, but he too was given a life sentence, condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. In the courtroom, as the verdicts were read, the legend of Corpsewood Manor loomed larger than the men themselves. The trials were not remembered for the details of evidence or testimony, but for the imagery that had surrounded the case from the start. The devil's window, the pink room, the eccentric professor who had laughed in the face of death. In the end, justice was measured not in satisfaction, but in containment. The killers were caged, the community reassured, yet the story refused to die. Outside the courthouse, reporters spoke not of two men serving life sentences, but of a haunted castle and a crime that seemed to belong as much to folklore as to fact. With the trials concluded and the sentences handed down, Kenneth Brock and Tony West were dispatched into the grey, unchanging world of prison life. For Brock, the transition was a kind of living purgatory. Young and impressionable, he carried with him both the guilt of his actions and the heavy shadow of West's influence. In interviews later, Brock admitted his regret, repeating that he had never intended for things to spiral into murder. Yet remorse could not unmake the bodies in Corpsewood Manor, nor silence the echoes of gunfire that had sealed his fate. The courts showed him mercy by sparing him the death penalty, but in return, he would live out his days confined, haunted by the night he let himself be swayed by greed and by West's power. Tony West, by contrast, adapted to prison with the same coldness he carried into the courtroom. He never expressed regret, never softened his stance. To some fellow inmates, he boasted of the killings, presenting himself as a man who had punished degenerates rather than committed crimes. His lack of remorse only deepened the sense that he had been the true engine behind the violence, the one who had twisted Brock's fascination into a plan of blood. For him, life in prison became not a penance, but a stage where he could continue his performance of defiance. Outside the prison walls, the ripples of the murders lingered. In the nearby towns, people still whispered about the castle in the woods. Some spoke of Scudder and Odom as victims, men cut down for daring to live differently. Others clung to the myths, insisting that evil had been rooted out, that the strange, stained-glass devil had been a warning all along. The truth was murkier, caught between compassion and condemnation, fact and legend. For Scudder and Odom's friends back in Chicago, the news carried a bitter irony. They remembered the professor as brilliant, eccentric, and full of laughter, and Odom as loyal, though troubled. That they had sought peace in the woods, only to be destroyed by the very outsiders they welcomed, seemed a cruel twist of fate. Their dream of isolation had failed not because of spirits or demons, but because of men with guns and envy in their hearts. The killers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, but the story they left behind would never be confined. Corpsewood Manor itself remained, its ruins standing as a monument to the dream, the tragedy, and the legend that would outlive them all. Even after the courtroom lights dimmed and the killers disappeared into the monotony of prison life, Corpsewood Manor refused to fade quietly into history. The castle, though scarred and blood-stained, still stood in the remote Georgia woods, its brick walls weathering the seasons as a silent monument to the lives lost within. Over time, it became something more than a crime scene. It became a legend. Locals spoke of the manor in hushed tones, weaving the true events of 1982 into a tapestry of ghost stories and folklore. Some said that at night you could hear the howls of Scudder's mastiffs echoing through the trees, their spirits still guarding their masters. Others claimed the flicker of candlelight sometimes appeared in the broken windows, as if Scudder still sat inside, reading his books beneath the watchful eye of his stained-glass devil. The forest around Corpsewood took on an aura of dread, a place where few dared to linger after dark. Paranormal investigators soon added the manor to their itineraries. Ghost hunters arrived with cameras and tape recorders, eager to capture voices from beyond. Occult enthusiasts came seeking inspiration in the ruins, drawn by the same symbols that had once terrified the townsfolk. Even thrill-seekers and teenagers found their way up the overgrown paths, daring one another to step inside the remnants of the Pink Room or touch the weathered stones of the castle walls. Each visitor carried the legend a little further, ensuring that Corpsewood remained alive in the public imagination. But for all the supernatural tales, the ruins also became a place of quiet reflection. Some visitors left tokens, flowers, candles, even handwritten notes to honor Scudder and Odom, men remembered not for their eccentricities, but for their tragedy. For those who looked past the sensational headlines, Corpsewood represented the dangers of isolation, of prejudice, and of how myths can twist lives into symbols. Decades later, the castle remains in partial ruin, overtaken by vines and the relentless creep of the forest. The gargoyles crumble, the stained glass is shattered, but the story persists. Corpsewood is no longer just a house. It is a cautionary tale, a haunted ruin, and a reminder of how thin the line is between eccentric dream and horrific nightmare. Long after the guns fell silent, the legend continues to breathe in the Georgia woods, whispered from generation to generation like a curse that refuses to die. The murders at Corpsewood Manor are often remembered for their strangeness: the devil's window, the pink room, the eccentric professor who laughed in the face of death. But beneath the lurid details lies a deeper truth about the world that surrounded Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom. Their tragedy was not born in a vacuum. It was shaped by prejudice, by fear of outsiders, and by a culture steeped in hysteria. Scudder and Odom were, in many ways, guilty only of being different. They were a same-sex couple in rural Georgia at a time when such openness invited scorn. They built a home that defied convention, filling it with art, books, and symbols that challenged the norms of a deeply conservative community. They lived unapologetically, and in doing so, they became targets. To their neighbors, they were not just men seeking peace in isolation. They were symbols of everything unfamiliar, everything frightening, everything that didn't belong. The Satanic Panic amplified this fear, turning eccentricities into supposed evidence of evil. A stained glass devil was not art, it was proof of worship. A library of occult texts was not curiosity, it was an arsenal of black magic. A wine-soaked gathering in the pink room was not hospitality, it was an orgy of corruption. The myths grew larger than the men, until Scudder and Odom were no longer seen as human beings at all, but as villains in a morality play the community had already written. And then came Brock and West, two men already shaped by poverty, resentment, and violence. They carried into Corpsewood not only their own greed, but also the prejudices of the world around them. West especially framed the murders as an act of righteousness, insisting that the killings were a kind of cleansing, a punishment for lives that defied his idea of decency. His words found echoes in a society that too easily believed the worst about Scudder and Odom. But the truth is simpler and more brutal. The Corpsewood murders were not acts of Satan, nor divine judgment, nor cosmic justice. They were the product of human fear, envy, and cruelty. A dream of freedom ended in blood, not because of demons lurking in the forest, but because of men who could not abide what they did not understand. The legend of Corpsewood may live on in ghost stories and whispered tales, but at its heart lies a reminder, as chilling as any haunting: fear of the other can be just as deadly as any weapon. Today, the ruins of Corpsewood Manor still stand, slowly being swallowed by the Georgia forest. Time has softened the bricks and toppled the gargoyles, but the aura of the place lingers. Visitors still make the trek up the overgrown path, some out of curiosity, others in search of ghosts. They wander through the shell of the castle, imagining the laughter that once echoed in the pink room, the warmth of Scudder's candles flickering against painted walls, and the sudden violence that turned this sanctuary into a tomb. For some, the ruins are haunted. For others, they are simply a reminder that beauty and tragedy often exist side by side. Those who come often leave tokens: candles, flowers, even small notes tucked between bricks. They are gestures of remembrance, tributes to Scudder and Odom, men who sought peace and freedom but found themselves devoured by the very hostility they thought they had left behind. Yet even in these acts of mourning, the myths persist. Stories of satanic rituals and blood-soaked pacts still cling to Corpsewood like vines to its broken walls. Myths are harder to kill than men, and Corpsewood has become a place where myth and memory blur until they are almost indistinguishable. But when we strip away the legend, what remains is stark and deeply human. There were no demons here, no curses or rituals that summoned death. There were only two men who dared to live differently, and two others who destroyed them out of greed, envy, and prejudice. The real darkness did not come from stained glass or painted devils, it came from human hearts. That truth is harder to face, and so people cling to the legend, because it is easier to blame Satan than to admit the cruelty we are capable of ourselves. And so, Corpsewood endures, not just as a ruin, but as a story of freedom sought and destroyed, of love and defiance, of fear twisted into violence. When the wind passes through the crumbling walls and rattles the forest branches, some say it carries whispers of that December night. But listen closely, and you will hear not demons, but the echoes of human folly. For in the end, it was never Satan who claimed the lives within Corpsewood Manor. It was men, and that, perhaps, is the most chilling truth of all. Before you go, subscribe to the Macabre Record and turn on notifications so you never miss a descent into history's darker corners. It helps more listeners find these stories, and it lets me keep digging into the archives. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, city, country, and what time of night, so I can shout a few of you out in the next episode.